1 year ago, I decided to become a full-time game developer and release my first commercial game. I'm going to take you on the journey from my first Steam release to now, which is the start of my second. And man, it's been a wild ride. Okay, so I started my game dev career with a really weird money-making scheme, actually. I actually tried to sell custom-developed games to trade show booths. Now, why would I do that? Well, I heard that trade show businesses were really interested in interactive displays and gamification, as means of attracting customers. So, I got to work and drove to the state fair with a prototype of a horse game. It was a basic racing game where you have to jump over obstacles. Not much to it, really. I remember that I traced over a free pixel art horse asset because I obviously can't draw horses myself. Like, I'm not actually talented. Anyways, the fair was rough. I'm actually terrified of people in general. I'm a game developer after all. So the idea of cold selling video games to strangers made me a nervous wreck. I walked around the fair for like an hour before I talked to someone, and he hated the idea. Despite this, I mustered up the courage to talk to several more booths, but I didn't make any sales. The only thing I made was more anxiety juice for my brain. That experience taught me to never, ever step outside of my comfort zone, even though nothing bad actually happened. I decided to just stick to the internet and make a Steam game, since that's what I actually wanted to do anyways. I started making this weird Breakout/Brickbreaker roguelike, but it was pretty lame, so I scrapped it and made Void Wizard, my FPS roguelike. The game turned out pretty good, and I learned a lot from the process, but it lacked content. I realized that for my next game, I needed a system that would allow me to create upgrades and whatnot way faster. But first, I read a game design book that changed my outlook on game development forever. The Art of Game Design is a book by Jesse Schell, a game designer who created Toontown and worked as an Imagineer for Disney. Isn't Imagineer just kind of a really stupid name anyways? Whatever, I don't know. Anyways, one thing I took away from this book is that fun can be thought of as surprise plus pleasure. Yes, this is a mathematical equation for fun. Sorta. It makes sense to me because if something is just pleasurable and not surprising, then it's not interesting. But if something is surprising, it's not necessarily enjoyable. If that weren't the case, then getting audited by the IRS would be really fun. This further convinced me that I needed to make a game with a lot of content that appears at random, specifically upgrades, and I still wasn't sure how to do it, but I got off track and made a pseudo-horror game for some reason. Wait, what? Subconscious Copy is a gloomy narrative-based game about a creature trapped in a version of Las Vegas that's floating in the sky. I've never made a narrative-heavy game before, so this was interesting. I had a lot of fun experimenting with the dialogue plugin that I used, as well as the new art style I tried out. I also added gambling because gambling is poggers. I still didn't know how to make a good upgrade system, and that's because roguelike upgrades can get pretty complicated. Some might increase a stat once, which is obviously very simple, but others might increase a stat based on a constantly changing variable, and others still might increase a stat by a set amount if and only if certain conditions are met. What I'm trying to say is that it's hard to keep track of everything, especially if you're able to stack upgrades, which I definitely want. Instead of working on this problem though, I decided to just play some more roguelikes to better understand the genre. This was actually a pretty good move, but the anxiety of not knowing how to handle upgrades in my own game was starting to get to me. I played Brotato, Tiny Rogues, 20 Minutes Till Dawn, Risk of Rain 2, my favorite, Patch Quest, Balatro, Atomicrops, and probably a few more that I'm forgetting. After I had my fill, I decided to make my own tiny roguelike to tackle the upgrade system. This is Bullet Billy. I made it in a couple weeks, and it has several upgrades that use a system I developed. Basically, instead of keeping track of all the variables the upgrades modify, whenever these variables need to be used, they just get passed through all the upgrades in real time. I do cache modified variables sometimes though, like variables used in movement, because that greatly improves performance. I know it's still not the most efficient solution, but it's pretty flexible and easy to work with. Now that I had my precious upgrade system, I was ready to make my next commercial roguelike. Except, there was another problem. They say that crises are opportunities in disguise, but the inverse can also be true. You see, I had an opportunity to run a really cool candy store, and I was seriously considering putting my game development career on hold. But then, in a moment of clarity, I realized that I'd probably just contract diabetes if I worked there, so I turned down the offer and started making my game. I was about to start production, but then I remembered the wise words of Jonas Tyroller, or however you pronounce it. Prototype, you idiot. So I made a few. The first one that stood out was this one where you place down plots of land and defend them. I really liked the possibilities of this one, but then I had a genius idea. I was playing Downwell, and I thought it would be really cool if it was focused on mining, and you had to mine to the bottom of the level to progress. I made it into a prototype, and it was insanely fun. I played it for hours, but then my heart got broken. You see, I sent the prototype out to people for playtesting, and they all discovered a major design flaw. Since the goal was to get to the bottom, the stronger you got, the easier it was to just skip all of the enemies. No matter how I adjusted the variables, people were always just mining past all the enemies. I tried changing the design so much. I made more enemies spawn the deeper you went, I made the blocks get harder to break the further you dig. I tried making it auto-scrolling, but none of these solutions worked very well. Then, several days later, I had an idea. Just change the goal, stupid. Ugh. So, I made it so you have to collect a certain amount of money, and the game was way better. I feel like an idiot in retrospect, but I actually felt like an elite super genius at the time. I was then ready to start production on my precious roguelike. To get started, I made some concept art. I started by drawing a wizard in a cave. I wanted to go for an old arcade game look, but it just looked amateur. I tried out a higher resolution style, but the thick lines made it hard to see small characters. I decided to make the game space themed, so I made another mock-up, and it still looked like an arcade game. I decided to try adding a background, and it looked way better. The concept art motivated me so much that I started developing like an addict. I made basic logic for the characters in the game. I added procedural level generation using Perlin noise. This is a simple version of a process that games like Minecraft and Terraria use. Adding these coins and health pickups was actually a lot of fun. They set their velocity at a random upwards angle when they spawn, so they look like they're bursting out of blocks when you break them. Taking a break from working on the core gameplay already, I added a little ship that acts as a hub. The ship is provided by your evil AI overlord. I needed something in the ship, so I added a shop owned by a totally unsuspicious shopkeeper. I wanted to be able to buy something from the shop, so I added 4 stats that you can increase: Strength, Intelligence, Stamina, and Dexterity. The game needed something that looks cool, so I added 4 status effects: Burn, Healing, Levitation, and Slowness. I haven't really utilized them very much yet, but I'm still glad I made them. Unfortunately, it's time for some pretty boring stuff like UI and whatever. So I added controller support. I had to manually make your character aim with a joystick, which was pretty easy, but I had a bigger problem. I'd have to deal with displaying all the icons for all the actions for every controller you could possibly connect to a PC. I was freaking out because I'd have to make hundreds of icons and deal with detecting the correct controllers, but luckily I found a plugin by some guy named Ricardo that just does exactly that. It does exactly what I wanted. So, nice. Thanks, Ricardo. After that, I added button remapping. I had some issues, but I eventually worked through them, and it actually took less time than I thought it would initially, even though it was pretty annoying. So that's another W. Gamers. Did I do that right? Probably. Okay, back to the cool stuff. I added some more enemies. These guys help keep the game interesting by attacking you in different ways, and their patterns can combine to make things even more difficult. Title screens are poggers, so I made a very poggers title screen because I am poggers. Anyways, I animated this pickaxe in the logo and made it make mining sounds, which I was very proud of. I also added a credit screen, and as you can see, I'm very lonely. The game almost had a gameplay loop, but it was missing enemy spawning. First, I added these portals that can spawn enemies, and then I added a script that spawns these portals in. I made it so that I can fine-tune which enemies spawn at which points of time, as well as the frequency and wave size. This will be extremely useful for creating a good and interesting experience. Next, we needed some lore. So I added an exposition cutscene that plays the first time you boot up the game. Basically, there's this evil AI, and it's like an actual sentient AI, unlike the quote-unquote AI we have now. It hates humans because they accidentally made it suffer, so it enslaved humanity and forced them to mine for gold. Why gold? Well, I fear it has something to do with me. Okay, I need to add some more interesting decision making, so I created these ores that contain money. I love money. Sorry. The idea is that players will often have to decide if they want to risk it and mine towards these ores, even though it may be more dangerous. Feeling excited from creating the ores, I wanted to make the world more interesting, so I added 3 more biomes that spawn the further down you go. I also made it so that the size of the biomes increases each level. This is to keep you from earning too much money early on, as lower biomes have blocks that are much harder to break. I wanted to make the game scarier, so I added this freaky looking mini-boss called the Sloppler. Ew. He has these tentacles that rotate around his body, or would you call that a head? I don't know, but he's got a scary face, so let's move on. Okay, we're finally adding some real upgrades. I finally get to utilize my upgrade system, so let's make these upgrades really cool. First, I added some gun boots. I thought it was fitting since this game was originally inspired by Downwell. Saws were next on the agenda, so I made some that rotate around you. I want to make all upgrades infinitely stackable, so I had to deal with rotating the saws correctly when buying more. This was actually kinda hard. I thought the issues I was having were due to my crummy math skills, but it turns out it was a programming error. The game wasn't actually rotating all of the saws, so once I found that out, it was easy to fix. The last upgrade I added was the lava casing, which causes enemies to ignite when taking damage from anything. It originally was only going to set enemies on fire with your primary attack, your pistol, but I thought this was more interesting. And that's the whole year. It's been a crazy journey, but it's also been a lot of fun. If Comet Rogue looks interesting, go wishlist it on Steam. Please, please. A demo will be coming out fairly soon. There will be a link in the description, or you can just search for it on Steam. If the game looks really interesting, you can join the Discord server to get exclusive updates. Link in the description. And as always, keep on gaming, gamers. YouTube!
It was like, you're just so down to earth. You're just so human.